Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's so good to see each and every one of you. Today is a great day because God is good all the time, and all the time, God is good. Today marks the third week of our Family Emphasis Month, and I hope that this has been a time of benefit to you and your family. I hope that it's been a time of encouragement and a time of challenge. And I hope that we've been able to provide a tool or a thought, some kind of idea, or maybe just simply a question for you to ponder that will help you and your family continue to grow. And I hope that we've been able to communicate the importance of us as the family of God seeking to grow the families that comprise it. And I hope that we've been able to adequately communicate that regardless of the size of your family, regardless of whether your immediate family is here or elsewhere, regardless of whether you have children or not, or married or single, each of us plays a vital role within the family of God, but each of us also plays a role in supporting the families that are around us. Because ultimately our goal is to help one another to grow closer to God. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a Wednesday. And I suppose it was a Wednesday much like any other Wednesday. And yet there was something about this day that was markedly different. Something that made this day special. And I remember as I walked down that seemingly endless hallway thinking to myself how this day had changed my life. How this day had altered the course of my very existence. As I walked through those double doors, though I was still in a sense of shock, I remember being hit with the gravity of what had taken place. I walked across the room and I turned to my right, and as my eyes beheld what was before me, I remember being struck with a sense of, wow. As I looked and saw my son wrapped in this new swaddling clothes, I guess is what you'd call them, there on that little newborn table, I remember thinking, wow, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. My blood courses through his veins. I remember thinking, wow. But those emotions that I experienced then would pale somewhat in comparison to the emotions I was about to experience as the nurse walked up to me and said, "Hey, would you like to hold him?" To which I responded, "Well, yeah." And as she took up this little bundle and placed my newborn son in my arms, I remember three distinct feelings, three distinct thoughts that came crashing into my head. And the first was, man, I hope he doesn't break. You know, I've carried many things in my lifetime, and I've helped a whole bunch of different people move. And every once in a while, I come across a box with the name or with the word fragile written across it. And you know, you're really careful with those boxes. You make sure to step just right, and you make sure to put it in the right place on the truck. But never have I been so concerned that something was just going to fall to pieces as when my son was placed in my arms. Never have I been so concerned that if I moved the wrong way or stepped the wrong way, that this child would just fall to pieces in my arms. There was a second distinct thought, a second distinct feeling that hit me. That was this intense need, intense feeling to protect. In fact, I remember as I looked around the room and saw all these NICU nurses, all who would rush to my son's aid at a moment's notice, I still remember this feeling, this thought of, don't touch my baby. Go get your own baby. Don't touch my baby. This need to protect. But I remember a third feeling that entered my head as well, and that was this feeling of, what in the world have I gotten myself into? I remember looking down and thinking, how can I be a dad? How in the world am I supposed to do this? What in the world have I gotten myself into? And I suspect that those of you who are parents at some point have had that same general thought, that same general feeling as well. You know, it's 3 years later now. I heard an amen. Somebody's really felt that. I remember it's 3 years later now, but I still have those moments, that feeling of, what in the world have I gotten myself into? Times when I think, do I have any idea what I'm doing? Yep, nope. Times whenever I question, am I doing the right thing? Have I made the right decision? Is this the best thing for my son? And I can't help but think that that feeling is part of what makes parenting such a challenge. You see, parenting is the most exhausting, the most tiring, the most terrifying, the most fear-inducing, one of the scariest things known to man. Did I mention that parenting is scary? And yet, parenting is one of the most rewarding, one of the most fulfilling experiences that mankind has experienced and mankind can experience. And I suspect that part of the reason that makes it both such a challenge and such a reward is this feeling of, what in the world have I gotten myself into? I'd like to take just a minute to thank you all as my church family for everything that you've done for me and my family, for the way that you've taken care of us, for the time that you've invested in us, for the counsel and the advice, for the babysitting, and if nothing else, just the watchful eyes as you have taken care of me and my family. And I thank you for everything that you've done and everything that you're going to do for us in the future. And it's this idea, the way that you guys have taken care of us, is that is at the heart of family emphasis. But not just the way you've taken care of my family, but the way that we take care of all families that comprise the family of God. See, every single family, every single parent at some point in their life needs support, needs encouragement, needs someone to come along and say, I remember that stage. That was a tough stage. But you know what? We got through it. It's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Your child's going to be okay. You're doing a good job. We all need just a little bit of encouragement. You all need a watchful eye, a little bit of counsel, a shoulder to cry on, and certainly a lot of prayer. When we think in terms of the Bible, I doubt that the very first thing that comes to our mind is parenting advice. And yet the Bible has many instances of parenting suggestions, parenting advice, and even parenting examples. If you will, turn with me to Hosea chapter 11, and we're going to read verses 1 through 4. When we do think in terms of parenting advice or parenting passages within the Bible, I highly doubt that the book of Hosea comes to our mind. Instead, we probably think of books like Ephesians or 1 Corinthians or maybe Deuteronomy chapter 6. But in this passage, I believe that we not only see a softer, gentler, fatherly figure of God, I believe we also see an example that you and I as parents should seek to emulate. Let's read. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them and fed them. Let's read verse 1 one more time. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Throughout the Bible, God shows his love for his people, his love for his children. He does it through the way he provides for them, whether it be in the providing food or water or maybe just simply a land to live in. He does it in the way that he protects them, when he protects them from harm. And he does it in the way that he continually accepts Israel back, even though Israel continues to rebel against him. But God doesn't just simply show his love for his children. Instead, he also tells them how much he loves them. He tells them that he loves them. This leads us to parenting point number 1. Tell your children, I love you and I'm proud of you. In fact, these words are so important that the very first words we have recorded of God speaking to his son Jesus when Jesus is on this earth is, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased." In other words, the very first words that God speaks to his son Jesus when Jesus is on this earth is, I love you and I'm proud of you. Those words seem to contain a certain power, seem to be very powerful words. And let me encourage you to every day tell your children that I love you and that I'm proud of you. For some of you, this may be a little difficult, a little uncomfortable. Perhaps you didn't grow up hearing these words in your family. Perhaps these were not words that were spoken to you. Let me encourage you, if it is a little bit uncomfortable, do it anyways. And eventually it will become more comfortable, a little less uncomfortable. And let me encourage you, if it is a little bit of a challenge, make a habit. Pick a time, pick a place throughout your day when you can intentionally tell your children, I love you and I'm proud of you. Maybe it'll be when when they first wake up. And you're about to head off to work, they wake up and you say, hey, I hope you have a great day. Remember, I love you and I'm proud of you. Or maybe it'll be when they're getting ready to go to bed and you say, sweet dreams, remember, I love you and I'm proud of you. Maybe it'll be when you drop them off at the bus, or when you drop them off at school and you tell them, I love you and I'm proud of you. And these words should be told to our children every day throughout the course of their life, whenever they're younger and whenever they're teenagers. Sure, when they're teenagers, you're going to tell them, I love you and I'm proud of you, and they're going to respond, I know, Dad, stop embarrassing me. But whether they realize it or not, those words are important and they have meaning to them. Tell your children, even once they've left the house, I love you and I'm proud of you. I'm convinced that children who don't hear those words grow up lacking something, because those words have a certain power. So tell your children every day, I love you and I'm proud of you. Let's skip down to verses 3 and 4. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. And I bent down to them and fed them. Can't you just see a dad teaching his son to walk? Can't you just see a dad as he takes the hands of his son, as they put one foot in front of the other and they begin to walk him, and maybe they waver a little bit, but dad's right there to make sure that he's able to learn how to walk. Or maybe you can see a dad as he gets down on his child's level and says, hey, come here, you can do it, walk to me, come on. And they celebrate as the child takes his first steps. Or maybe you can see dad sitting down in the living room floor as together they play blocks or play cars, or maybe with his daughter plays tea party or dress up. See, in this passage, we read how God from infancy sought to build a relationship with his people, sought to build a relationship with his children. And this leads us to parenting point number 2. Build a relationship with your children. Talk to your children about tough issues and hard questions. Be sure that you're the ones who talks to your children about the birds and the bees. Don't let the world do that. Don't just simply give them a book. Certainly don't let the school do it. Be sure that you as a parent are the one who has that conversation. Be sure that in this crazy world, as people are trying to decide what gender identity is and all those things, be sure that you have that conversation with your children as well. Don't leave that up to somebody else. Talk about what it means to be married, what your faith means, and what it means to be a Christian. Talk about tough questions and hard issues. Admittedly, these conversations sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge to start. And that's where the relationship comes in. Find something that you and your children can do together. Specifically, it'd be best if you find something that your child enjoys doing. Maybe it's a hobby or an interest that they really enjoy, and that's something that you can do with them. And in doing so, you will enter their world, and you'll be able to not only build a relationship, you'll learn more about them, learn what makes them tick. Now, some of you might say, well, hold up just a minute. My child and I, we really don't have anything in common. We really don't share any of the same interests. He likes video games, and I like cars. She likes computers, and I would much rather be in my garage. Admittedly, building that relationship can be a little bit more of a challenge. But you still choose to build it anyways. Rick Hoyt was born in 1962. And due to oxygen deprivation at birth, he was diagnosed as a spastic quadriplegic with cerebral palsy and would spend the rest of his life struggling to communicate. In 1977, with the help of a computer, he told his dad, Rick, that he wanted to, told his dad, Dick, that he wanted to join a 5-mile marathon. His dad had never really run marathons before, wasn't necessarily all that interested in them, but he loved his son. And so he built Rick a specialized wheelchair, and together they began preparing for the upcoming race. When the race was over, Rick told his dad, Dad, I want to race again. To which Dick asked, well, why? And his son responded, Dad, when we're running and I feel the wind rushing through my face, I don't feel handicapped anymore. But instead, I feel free. And so together, they ran. Running marathons and triathlons and Ironmans and a whole host of other races. Every step of the way, there was Dick pushing his son in his wheelchair. Together they ran over 1,000 races. But why? Why did Dick go to all that trouble for his son? I mean, I understand maybe a race or two out of the year. I mean, make sure your son feels like he's free. I get that. But why 1,000 races? And why Ironmans? I mean, Ironman is one of the hardest races that we know of. And yet, there's Dick training not just for one person. He's training for 2 people. Well, the answer is quite obvious. Because he loves his son. You see, you choose to engage in activities. You choose to build a relationship with your children because you love them. And quite frankly, you really don't have to like or even enjoy an activity to enjoy that activity with your child. Does that make sense? Let me say that again. You really don't have to like or even enjoy a particular activity in and of itself to enjoy doing that with your children. Now, sure, it'd be great if you can find an activity where you both enjoy doing it. I mean, if you like sports and he likes video games, hey, play Madden, play 2K16. Find some kind of sports video game. It's great if you can find something where it overlaps. But even if you can't find an area where both of your interests overlap, do it anyways. And your child will know that you have chosen to do that activity because you love them. I read an article once about a mother who was struggling with her son. The relationship just didn't seem to be all that great. She would ask her son a question and she'd get that typical, one-word answer. It's like talking to a brick wall. But her son loved movies. And he didn't just love watching movies. He loved everything about movies. He loved understanding why did the director choose to do it in this way? And what was the writer trying to communicate over here? And understanding the different acting styles. Now, his mom, she wasn't necessarily all that crazy about movies. She could take them or leave them. Just wasn't a big deal. But she loved her son. And so she began brushing up on all kinds of different movie titles, classics and new movies, all kinds of different movies. She began learning what it means to direct and the different kinds of directing. She made sure to take the time to learn about the different acting styles and the different kind of writings. And so her son and her would go watch movies. And on their way home, they would talk about those movies. They would talk about what they'd seen, the different kinds of directing. They would talk about what the actor was doing over here and what was the writer trying to get across over here. Now, sure, these conversations started off a little one-sided. But eventually, over time, her son began to open up more and more. And eventually, he began to open up about things that were going on in his life. Struggles that he was facing and challenges that were coming up. Questions that he had. But those conversations would have never taken place if his mom hadn't first sought to build a relationship with him. If she hadn't first entered into his world. Now sure, this applies to parents, but it also applies to every single person in this room. I hear many people talk in terms of the world, and the world's all going to pot, and that we really wish the world would change. If you really wish the world would change, invest in the future that's coming up. Seek to build a relationship with those of the next generation. Find an activity that they enjoy and seek to build a relationship with them. Because remember, each and every person is essential to the success of the individual family. So seek to build a relationship with your children. Now some of you might say, well, I'm my child's parent. I'm not their friend. Why can't you be both? And after all, God is certainly our Lord and certainly our master and our authority, but He's also described as the friend of Abraham. See, parenting is necessary for teaching, but a relationship is essential for influence. And as your children grow, as they enter into high school and as they leave the house, that influence is going to be even more and more important. And eventually, most of what you'll have left over your children is the influence you have in them. And that influence is going to be heavily tied to the kind of relationship that you have built. So choose to build a relationship with your children. Let's go back to verse number 2. The more they, this is Israel, the more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. See, despite everything that God had done for his people, despite everything he'd done for his children, despite how he told them how much he loved them, despite how he had protected them and provided for them, despite how he built a relationship with them, Israel still fell short. They still chose to rebel. And the same is true for you and I as parents, that despite everything we do for our children, despite how much we tell them that we love them, despite the relationship we try and build with them, despite everything that we provide for them, our children are still going to fall short, and at times they're still going to rebel. If we were to go to Hosea chapter 12, we would read how, as a result of Israel's failure, as a result of their rebellion, God was going to discipline them. He was going to punish them in the form of captivity. And if we turn to Hebrews chapter 12, we would read that God disciplines those whom he loves. And that brings us to parenting point number 3. Discipline your children out of love. And we choose to discipline for at least 3 reasons. One, obviously, to teach our children the difference between right and wrong, why this is acceptable and why this is not acceptable. But it also teaches them about authority, what authority means and how to respond to that authority. And it teaches them how to self-correct, how to say, oh, this isn't the right direction. I mean, it's difficult to come back, but to come back to center. And a child who hasn't learned the difference between right and wrong, why this is acceptable and this is not, a child who hasn't learned what authority means or how to respond to that authority, and a child that hasn't learned how to self-correct, sadly, I think that child might be doomed to a life of heartache and hurt, a life of rather tough lessons. And so when you choose to discipline your children, when you do it out of love, and make sure to communicate that. It's part of what doing it out of love is all about, where we, after we've disciplined our children, we remind them, hey, I love you. And we tell them, I'm doing this because I love you, because I want you to succeed, because I want you to be successful. So choose to discipline your children out of love. The next one is lead by example. You see, in this passage of Hosea 11, 1-4, we've seen how God sought to build a relationship with his children. God communicated how much he loved, and God communicated the kind of relationship that he wanted Israel to give to him. He showed them in the way that he provided for them, and he showed them in the way that he took care of them. And even, quite frankly, the entire book of Hosea is a real-life example of the kind of relationship that God desired with his people. God told Hosea to go take the prostitute Gomer as his wife, and he did, and inevitably Gomer cheated on him. God told Hosea, go get her back. And so he did. And again, Gomer cheated on him, and he said, go get her back. And in this, we see God's relentless pursuit of his people. His relentless pursuit, his undying desire for a relationship with them. And the same is true for you and me today. The same is true for the kind of relationship that God desires with us. And he shows us in that he sent his son to die for us. And he shows that in that greater love hath no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friend. See, God desires the kind of relationship where we say, all that I am, all that I have is yours. But God doesn't just simply tell us that he wants that kind of relationship. Instead, he chose to show us. He chose to lead by example. And you and I as parents should seek to lead by example, to set an example for our children, to show them what it means to be an adult, what it means to be a Christian. Rodney Atkins sings a song called Watching You. And in that song, he portrays what every parent at some point begins to realize, and that is that children, they're sponges. They just seem to soak up everything. And like a sponge soaks up water, so children soak up our attitudes and our actions, our habits and our language. Remember how I said that we are a church family? The same principle applies not only to parents, but to every single person in this room. The next generation is watching you. We need to portray for them what it means to be Christians, what it means to be adults, what it means to make right decisions. Dan Fogelberg sings, or sung, I should say, what has become one of my favorite songs. And the song describes how a son chose to follow in his father's footsteps and pursue a life of music. And I believe that the chorus of this song beautifully depicts the reality of parents and their children. The leader of the band is tired, and his eyes are growing old. But his blood runs through my instrument, and his song is in my soul. My life has been a poor attempt to imitate the man. I'm just a living legacy to the leader of the band. When I hear that song, I immediately think of my dad and how I hope that I can be half the man, half the father that he is. And if I am, I'll have accomplished something. And I hope that you all in this room can relate. And when you think back to your parents, you think, if I can be half the man, if I can be half the woman they were, if I can be half the father or half the mother they were, then I'll have accomplished something. And I hope that one day Manny looks at me and says, if I can be half the man he is, if I can be half the dad he is, then I've accomplished something. Sometimes parents ask me, how can I help my children to become more spiritually minded? How can I help them be more interested in church? But before we can ask those questions, there's two others we have to ask first. And the first is, how have your children seen you grow spiritually lately? And the second is, what have you portrayed, how are you portraying what it means to be involved in church to your children? You see, our children are our legacy. And whether we like it or not, they will imitate us. They will pick up on all of our habits and the things that we do. And the best legacy that we can leave behind is our children, a future generation who has a personal relationship with God, who seeks to follow Him in every area of their lives, every day of their lives. Children who've been told, I love you and I'm proud of you. Children who not only have received discipline, but have discipline. And children who have the influence of their parents, the influence of other Christian adults in their lives. Our children are our legacy. What kind of legacy will you be leaving behind? Perhaps today you've realized you're not quite the parent you wish you were. Or perhaps you'd like to come forward and like for us to pray for you and to encourage you, and we will be happy to do so as we rally around you. Or perhaps you haven't yet chosen to accept Christ. And the very best example that you can show your kids is choosing to put Him on in baptism. If there's any way that we can assist you today, won't you come as together we stand and sing.
Hark the gentle voice of Jesus.